Well, hello there, everybody. Happy Friday. Thank you so much for joining me for a webinar on project management for a cybersecurity-centric organization. My name is Ashley Hunt. I'm the Senior Project Management Instructor here at StormWind Studios and PM Guru. So thank you so much for joining me today. I know cybersecurity is a massive topic. There's no way we'd be able to cover everything in 1 hour, but we are going to hit some high points, some topics. We're going to talk about risk management a little bit, but do me a favor, and those of you that chatted in and said, hello, hi, do me a favor, just chat in and let me know, what is your job role? What is your job role? And you can also chat in industry if you'd like, but it just gives me an idea. Cybersecurity, as mentioned, is such a large topic. We've got a ton of really great classes that are targeted more toward a lot of the things that we're going to be talking about today. But cybersecurity and network ops, hello. Job, PM, state government, Kim. Yeah, so it really, as far as the industry is concerned, Chief of PMO, Jen, hello. Gord, Planning for Cyber Team, awesome Z. Network Specialist, Project Manager, perfect. Wesley, Cybersecurity Training Administrator, excellent. Henry, Education IT Sys Admin, welcome. Sheila, Business Systems Analyst, Information Security, awesome, hi. Benjamin, Project Portfolio Manager. Sandy, IT Project Manager, wow, look at all you guys. Tom, Systems and Network Manager. Brian, IT, all cybersecurity. Senior Sys Admin. Wow, you wear all the hats for International Commodities Trading Company, James. You must have a lot of hats, James. I bet you look fantastic in all of them. Hi, Cal, Network Analyst, Rob, IT PM, Lorna, hi, Cybersecurity Engineer. All right. So as far as what I'm seeing coming in, we have a big mix between IT, project management, but we all have to worry about cybersecurity, right? Hi, Lorna, cybersecurity engineer. Awesome. How many of you have a certification in project management? Do I have any PMPers in here? Hi, Verna, system analyst. If so, all of the webinars that I do count toward professional development units. Hi, Kim. Oh, look at all my PMPers. Hi, Horse Network Engineer. Rita, Kim, yay, yay, counts for PDUs. If you're not sure what that is, it's a professional development unit for those of you that have your PMP and you're trying to maintain your certification. IT security manager. Okay, yeah, you've got a lot of certs. And I would imagine if you have professional development units for those or CEUs, something like this would count because it kind of covers some of those areas. But look, it's going to be fairly high level. I am going to have some documents for you later on today that if you want to utilize them, you certainly can. If you've taken classes with me before, risk management doesn't really change. Some of the things that we're going to be talking about, you probably have seen before. But what are the differences between data security and compliance? Some of the things that we're going to talk about are the identify, protect, detect, and so on. Hello, Pat. Respond and recover framework. Super high level. We only have an hour, but then we'll talk about risk management maturity levels and some best practices. And also, I want to tie in the new CompTIA Project Plus. How many of you have folks on your team that you're trying to get to that point where maybe they're newer to IT, maybe you want them to have a little bit of experience, not necessarily to the level of a PMP, although that's good too. But some of the changes that CompTIA has made are starting to address the need for more IT security, project management, risk management. How many of you practice agile, predictive, or hybrid? How many of you, and I'm just curious, we're not really going to go in too much into predictive, agile, hybrid, but we'll talk a little bit about it. But as far as the sort of trend in project management, we're seeing a lot more agile-esque or hybrid types of project management to try and stay in front of, on a regular basis, some of these things that are happening in the world today. Kim, hybrid, only development is in sprints. That's right. I remember development only in sprints. And so as far as, hybrid versus agile versus predictive, it doesn't really matter the frameworks that you're utilizing because we all have to worry about data security. It sounds like a lot of you are already in that world. So, obviously the process of safeguarding digital information is getting more and more difficult. Bad guys are getting better, right? So trying to make sure that we're protecting our organizations. Agile's a great framework. We're just saying, yeah. And the cool thing about Agile and some of the things that we'll be talking about is that ability to have more of not just a front-loaded plan like in predictive, but also to be able to identify impediments, identify some of the issues that are coming up on a regular basis, especially in cybersecurity, IT, that kind of thing. Having those regular check-ins are a really great way of getting ahead of it. Sandy, did Agile Hybrid as a shared resource across 4 teams for 5 years in another life? Awesome. Yeah, like I said, we're not going to get real into like the specifics between. When we talk about risk management, a lot of the best practices that we'll be going through, I've used for both and continue to use for both. So when we're looking at confidentiality, integrity, availability, the CIA triad, which I'm sure most of you are familiar with, and not the CIA, although maybe they use this too. Who knows? But the CIA triad. So confidentiality, integrity, and so on. So preventing unauthorized access using security measurements. How many of you have 2-factor or 3-factor authentication, which is hard to say, already set up in place? And I know it's kind of a pain because I went through it today just to get signed in, and I'm like, send me a text. All right, fine. But yeah, we want to make sure that everybody is who they say they are. Yeah, lots of yeses. That's a big thing right now. Changing passwords, trying to remember password after password after password. How about formal change control or configuration management? Because there's a lot of yeses. 2-factor, 3-factor, monitoring, alerts, those kinds of things, getting people to change their passwords. How about right now? How many of you are hybrid, virtual, or back in the office? Yes, required by cyber insurance, Bob saying absolutely. Sandy's like all of the above. Yeah, full in person, hybrid, in the office, virtual hybrid. Yeah, we're seeing a lot more hybrids, but mostly remote. Rita's saying, nice. So how is that transition between those of you that were, in the office? I know some of you still are. Some of you are hybrid now. How is the transition during the pandemic? We all got to go virtual. How is that transition? Did you feel like it went pretty well? And did you feel like the rollout could have been easier? I know some people in my classes said, hey, we just put these new best practices into play, and then boom, we rocked it, Sandy said. I hear that a lot. We put this into play, and then it already happened. Yes, it was an opportunity in the midst of a challenge. Rita saying, yeah. Kim, yes, went well. We are in process, Benjamin's saying. So that was definitely something that sort of rocked everybody's world a little bit to try and get to that point. Some rocked it and were ready for it. Some were not. Chris, we implemented Office 365 at the same time everyone was going remote. That was fun, I bet. Doug, went well, but increased threat plane. Absolutely increased threat plane. Because not only do you have, and we're going to talk a little bit about this as well, but not only do you have, people that are potentially using their own equipment, trying to VPN in, sometimes there's that, not as much control as maybe if they were all using the equipment in the office. So definitely have that increased threat plane, trying to protect data. So much today is based on digital signatures and secure transactions. That's a big thing for me just in online shopping. Is this a secure transaction, right? Sandy says a lot of security compliance issues with Zoom. When the pandemic first happened, for sure. So we had to find a more secure video conferencing and collaboration solution. Yeah, because if you're a bad guy or gal, what are you going to hack into? Meetings, right? We were cyber attacked and that forced us to get started. So yeah, it was as a response to that. And it's one of those things trying to stay in front of, what's going on in the world and staying educated. And it's moving so quickly that either in some cases you rocked it, you had plans in place, or it was a reaction to something, or we have this big world event, pandemic, and now all of a sudden everybody's using Zoom and Teams and things like that. Fall behind as slowly as possible, right, Wesley? And that's all we can really do is just try and stay at least a half a step ahead of what's going on in the world. And actually, a true story, there was an iPhone update. And so my boss like texted me, and it was, after hours or whatever, and said, "Hey, make sure you update, your iPhone. There's a big update." And I said, "Are you a hacker?" Question mark. But I was like, it's kind of weird, like, my iPhone, are you sure? So even at that point, I'm sort of questioning, where is this coming from? But the availability ensuring security controls, systems, and software working properly, it really depends on what types of software you're using. Is it cloud-based? Those types of things. And how are our people logging in? If you have people VPN in, sometimes there's some concern there. So there are challenges, obviously, cyber attacks, theft, loss of devices, those kinds of things, data theft by employees. I hope you don't have to worry about that. But it does happen. You read about it on the news all the time where you have these whistleblowers and things, and good for them. But at the same time, theft from employees and just human error. Oops, we clicked a link. I'll never forget when I first started way back when, 100 years ago at AOL. And I'm talking like early 2000s where dial-up was still being utilized. Somebody in the organization clicked on a link in an email, and it was a hacker email. It looked like it was coming from the CEO. So even way back, dial-up, have to worry about, security breaching and everything getting shut down. Data breaches on average cost about $4 million a year per company. That's not just in total, right? And based on the research that I was doing, well, I know, LOL, US has the highest breach costs. And I'm not sure why that is. Maybe it's just because the industries there's a lot of organizations that have headquarters in the US. But healthcare, do I have anybody in healthcare? I find it odd that healthcare as of right now, reports have the highest breach costs, right? Because of HIPAA and medical data. Yeah, Dave, lawyers, yeah. Lorna, yes, yeah. And that they're going to pay. I mean, I'm reading all these articles about like holding hostage. Like we have your information. We're not letting it go until you pay X amount of money. I know that's what I said. AOL, LOL. Yeah, higher ed for sure. And so compliance or having a baseline for security controls, we have this triad of people, process, and technology. And the technology is moving at 100 miles an hour, if not faster. What data do we have to store? What is the value of the data? And how do we address risk management? As mentioned, there's not a ton that we can do in 1 hour, but we will talk about risk management. How many of you have a pretty healthy risk strategy in place? Maybe you're using a risk register, which we'll talk about, a risk management plan. How many of you, or is there a lot of putting out fires? And you'd be surprised how many people in my Agile classes and in my PMP classes and that kind of thing just grab the fire hose when something happens. Not to say that you don't have preemptive, firewalls in place and that kind of thing, but really focusing on risk management. Always room for improvement. I love that, Radio, because risk, just like security, those types of things, could happen. And yeah, it could be an opportunity. But let's face it, we're worried about threats, right? You often step on your own toes, Kim. And that's finding that balance. And we'll talk a little bit about this as we get into the risk section. But finding that balance between too much and not enough. And speaking of healthcare, the pharmaceutical industry, the largest documentation of risk I've ever seen in my life was a pharmaceutical company. And their biggest complaint was, yeah, we got to do this because it's legal. We have to. But man, do we spend so much time just documenting potential risks. Sandy, we have a strong foundation. It definitely needs some enhancements. We're getting there for sure. Benjamin's asking, how much does risk management cost? It doesn't have to cost any. You know what it costs more? Is not having it. So if you wanted to hire a legit risk manager, yeah, they're expensive. But what are some of the things that we can do in our day-to-day to try and get in front of it. You probably, well, we're all going to step on toes. We're all going to miss something along the way. But if we can get into that pattern of trying to make sure that we're staying in front of it, then it's going to cost a lot less than a threat event happening. Yeah, I wonder if you can touch on the quantitative value of government data. How do you build a quantitative analysis of the value of data when we do not have income or loss, like for a profit, like a for-profit company does? We're going to talk a little bit about expected monetary value. The hardest part is trying to quantify something that's subjective. And I think that's kind of what you're alluding to, Chris, is how do we quantify or put a price tag on something that is intangible or subjective? And in a lot of ways, it's just making objective or mathematically or statistically quantifying subjective information. But what it can do is help us make better decisions when we assess probability and then impact even financially or in time, something like that. And it would be hard for me to answer that question without having a full-blown conversation with you, but we will talk about quantitative. And support actually just put links in there. These are pretty generic, but they're good jumping off points if you're not utilizing any kind of risk documentation. These attachments look risky. They're not, I promise. No, one's a risk management plan and one's a risk register. If you feel risky about downloading it, you don't have to. But yeah, that's hilarious. I love their risk documentation. But I'm always a big fan because I know I talk, speaking of subjective, I know a lot of this is like philosophy and information and, not actual, like, I'm going to go back to work now and implement these things. So I like to have documents for people to look at. I give out templates and things like that as a jumping off point to say, hey, are we doing something similar? Or is this, a recommended best practice? Yes, in fact, Dave, the risk register is the second one, the second link. I do it in Excel. I'm going to show you what it looks like, and we'll go through a little bit of it just to give you an idea about how it works. But starting with data asset inventory, that includes number of records, and then applying per record cost if there's a breach. That's awesome. Yeah, still, it's like, how do we take information and label it in money? Because value or loss is different to different people. Yeah, Rita's saying that data asset inventory can include columns on types of records. I love that. That's awesome. And you know what's so cool about doing a webinar like this or having you all in my classes and other classes is the transfer of information that comes from those of you that are actually in class, and the helping of everybody else that's in that class as well is absolutely amazing. And one of the things that I encourage in all my classes is to have these conversations. Is to say, what are you using? How do you identify? How do you protect? How do you detect? How do you respond? How do you recover? Well, it'd be tough to say depending on your industries or what your best practices are, what legal requirements you have, what are your organizational process assets, meaning here's what the organization says to do. PMOs typically are driving that. And I saw some PMOs in here, head of PMO. But having that department, whether it's a threat department, a PMO department, that kind of thing, can help drive best practices. And it takes time. Perfect practice makes perfect, that kind of thing. But having full visibility into assets as much as humanly possible and understanding potential current threats. Now, I know opportunities are part of risk management as well, but, great, we'll take it. It was an opportunity. But our big focus is threat. Right? The threat focus. And having the best people already sort of there or pre-assigned when things go sideways, this is the person that deals with it, is definitely a good way to get started. We'll talk about risk owners as well. And what are the levels of acceptance? Because we can't always stop everything that we're doing and, we've got to implement this response. And, we've got to deal with that. You're putting out those fires. But what is the level of acceptability in a probability impact risk threat situation? Is our software going to catch it? Or is this something that we need to do and deal with, to protect, control access to digital physical assets? Obviously, training, education and training, and maintaining baselines of changes. Configuration management typically is product change control or how things get reconfigured, installs, different softwares, that kind of thing, and having some baselines set in place. All of this, easier said than done. Totally get it. I completely understand. The detect piece, that continuous monitoring and network visibility, so that when a cybersecurity event happens, we can deal with it quickly. And so, have you watched the Unseen War? Have you seen that? I think it's on, might be Prime, might be Amazon Prime, but it's a really, really great show about how you have this large government entity that is protecting against cybersecurity attacks from other countries, and how they had level upon level, knowing exactly how they were going to respond. They set it up in such a way that by doing that normal response or expected response, it triggered the next thing. And so I was like, when you watch that, you think, okay, well, there are very specific steps that we all take in a lot of ways to detect and then correct and then respond. And so having that backup plan, we'll talk about secondary risks, residual risks, and so on. But the response plan, how do we know for a fact it's going to work? Well, maybe it's worked in the past, okay? But at the same time, how do we know if there's another contingency or a way to do that? Yeah, the normal response to unprepared is panic, Mike's saying. Absolutely. To panic, and then at that point, we don't have anything to fall back on. And so part of the big conversation that we're having today is about risk, is about preparing. And I get it. It's probability, it's impact, it's, are you a risk taker? Are you more risk averse? I would have to imagine if I asked all of you, right? Are you a risk taker in general, or are you risk averse in general? And I can kind of tell by some of your job roles that in a lot of ways you have to be risk averse no matter what at work, because you're trying to protect. So maybe you're a risk taker in your real world. Maybe you like jump out of perfectly good airplanes or something like that. But how to respond, how to communicate, averse to losing my job, right? Okay, so we'll call it risk averse then. In your real world, maybe jumping out of a perfectly good airplane, swimming with sharks. But at work, I'm averse to losing mine as well. But collecting and analyzing information. How about a communications plan? If this event occurs, does it like trigger a communication structure? Is there a communications plan in place? And I don't just mean for project management, although it is considered one of the sort of big documents that we're supposed to have. But what is the chain of command? I remember when I was younger, I grew up in Pennsylvania, and so we would have snow days, and there was this phone tree. So every time, that there was this big snowstorm and things like that, it would launch this phone tree. So when I think about a communications management plan, that's what I'm thinking about. Sandy, I grew up in New Hope, Doylestown, Bucks County area. So yeah, Pennsylvania, that's where I grew up. But snow days, right? Do you remember those phone trees? But implementing those response plans and trying to incorporate lessons learned. Well, there you go. We were practically neighbors. But previous strategies, lessons learned, historical information, those kinds of things. How about lessons learned? Do y'all do lessons learned meetings? Do you have a document, like a lessons learned? We call it a register because it gets updated, but lessons learned register, something that you utilize to update what worked, what didn't work, that kind of thing. Is the name of the show, where's asking, Cybercrime? No, I think it's called like The Unseen War. And it has Simon Pegg in it, who I love. But yeah, check that one out. But I'll look at that one too. Kim, yep, love lessons learned. And the cool thing about Agile, one thing that I really like about Agile is the ability to not only pivot quickly, but also to have that option of retrospectives and daily stand-ups where we're documenting lessons learned in a lot of ways, weekly, if not daily. But it's a really good best practice, whereas a lot of times in predictive project management, lessons learned is happening at the end of a project, and then it's like undeclared. Thank you, Chris. That's the one. Thank you. Yeah, that's the one. It's really good. You'll love it. And if not, I'm sorry. but I loved it. But recovering, having that recovery in place, coordination with external parties, lessons learned, continuous improvement. But if you have that lessons learned meeting monthly, even, that's going to keep problems right in the forefront, front and center, and give you the opportunity to have discussions and adapt and adjust because they're adapting and adjusting, they being the bad guys, right? So in a risk management type of framework, we have to consider different variables. So let's say project management, one of the risks is like, we're over budget or we're behind schedule. But when we're talking about cybersecurity risks and data integrity and protection and that kind of thing, we are dealing with different categories: physical, cyber, and human. So physical, we know. I mean, come on, lock the door. Although I'm one of those people that I'll get ready, I'll get into bed, and I'll be like, did I lock the door? You know, did I turn the alarm on? Those kinds of things. So these are fairly, well, duh. But how many of you have cameras around in your office or in your house? PMI recommends this thing, and we laugh a little bit about it in the PMP classes because it just seems like such a huge risk. But one of the things that they recommend, I know, Kim, right? And I think we even had this conversation, but have it being on camera all the time when you're a virtual employee, right? And I'm like, no, they call it a fishbowl. No, I don't want to be on camera all the time. 800 physical cameras in district. I'm stuck running them. Oh no. Well, public school, right? Oh, we got to protect the kids. But that's a lot. 800 physical? Ugh. Nah, measure results. No, 10-4, right? Got to protect the kids for sure. And so when we talk about, protection from attack, physical as well, because you have technology attached to these alarm systems, to these cameras, and so on. But the human side, I think, is where we can apply the most improvement, right? Training, policy, procedure, compliance. We talk a little bit about compliance in the PMP classes as part of the business environment domain. But just like myself, I can't get really into what's compliant for you, what's compliant for everybody else. Oh, Carroll County Jail, about 3,000 cameras. Right, for protection. CCTV, right? And probably being recorded, I'm guessing. So not just like cameras that you can check in real time, but things being recorded. Illegal activity, theft of data, we know, but virtual employees using their own equipment, which, I mean, in some cases, it's no biggie, right? And other cases, it might be. So it's just a matter, especially when everybody went virtual, right? The tendency to utilize your own laptop or something for a Zoom call. But cyber risk categories, we know governance, right? Hardware, firmware, software, bring your own device, phishing, social media. And one of the things too is that especially with phishing, I get a gazillion junk mails every single day. And I've got like a new scam in my email box, and it was a scam that I knew my father-in-law would fall for. So the very first thing we did was call him and say, do not click on this email. Don't do it. I know that you have an account with these people, for real, but don't click on this and give them your information, because that is definitely a scam. It's a total scam. So it's about social media. Scam too. I fall for the marketing though. I'm a sucker for marketing. But the risk management plan that we recommend has a couple things that are pretty important. For obviously strategy for certain things. Sometimes that's hard to qualify or quantify. What our methodologies are, who does what. But another thing that we talk about are contingencies. Do you have any kind of money set aside that you might call a contingency reserve or a management reserve? I mean, if there were an attack, cybersecurity attack, your organization has to pay, right? They're going to have to spend money. So is that money set aside in general as a contingency, what we call a contingency reserve for known, unknown risk events? We know this could happen. We don't know if it will. It might. And, as we go through this, there's going to be some analysis paralysis with risk. And that was a big complaint about the pharmaceutical industry that I was working with, because there were so many opportunities to document potential risks, but they were in human trials at the time. So they really absolutely had to document over and over and over again potential threats, probabilities, impacts, and so on. But there was also contingency money. There was also reserves, so that if we needed to spend money to implement something quickly, we could. Yep, that's the one. Sorry, I got the title wrong. I apologize. Undeclared. Unseen. Undeclared. But yeah, that's the one. It's really good. But and what I like about it is that whole puzzle of trying to figure out what the next move is. It's like a big old chess game. But timing, for me, the big aspect of the risk management plan is always going to be more about categories, and then stakeholder tolerance levels or appetites for seizing opportunities. And that could be possible. Maybe we're going to go utilize a brand new software program for protection, or we're going to implement cloud-based 365 or something like that. Those are opportunities because they come in a lot of cases with their own protections. But for the most part, we're talking about tolerance levels. Like, what is the level with which we now need to do something? And so with that being said, definitions of probability and impact are a great place to start. This is something that I see quite a bit, where people have a risk register, and it's almost like, here's what we think is going to happen, and here's, what we're assessing as far as probability and impact. Those of you that do utilize risk registers, that kind of thing, how do you assess probability and impact? Is it high, medium, low, red, yellow, green? I use a Likert 1 through 5 scale. But how do you classify identified threats, let's say, or opportunities, but mostly threats? How is probability and impact assessed? Or is it just, if this happens, that's going to be super bad? If it does. High, medium, low. Okay, Kim, perfect. Anybody else? Red, yellow, green. When we get into scoring, and we'll talk about expected monetary value to kind of circle back to that question of how do you apply a price tag to something that you don't know the price of? But using numbers, using a scalability type of structure, high, medium, low, red, yellow, green, there is no wrong way to do this. But the key is to make sure that anybody who's identifying threats or opportunities, but anybody who's identifying threats understands what a high is, what a medium or a low is. So going back to that whole question of, are you a risk taker or are you risk averse in general, is a really good question to ask your other stakeholders. Because if you've got somebody on your team, let's say, who's a risk taker, they're like, I'm going to go and absolutely, like, jump out of a plane, go swimming with sharks, whatever the case may be. The definition of probability and impact is important, because if I'm a risk averse person and they're a risk taker, they might be like, yeah, it's no big deal. Don't worry about it. And you're like, it is a big deal. I really think we should worry about this. So having documentation is going to be a really excellent way to get people all on the same page. Look, if it's below 1% probability and there's no impact, why even bother documenting it, right? But what is very high? What's a very high probability? 70%, greater than 70%. All right, well, how does that impact our schedule? How would that impact our budget? How would that impact our quality, etc.? And so for me, I like to use either numbers 1 through 5, but when we get to expected monetary value or the money value, the price tag of a threat or a potential threat, I like to use percentages and the impact financially at 100%, because what that does is it gives us an assessed price tag. There isn't a, this is 100% going to happen, get ready, everybody duck. It's not like that. It could happen, and it's got a high probability. And if it were to occur, what would that cost the organization? And so that way we can start looking at price tags. But the very first step is to make sure that everybody's in agreement on to what's a high, medium, or low. What's a red, yellow, green? What is probability and impact? Then we start getting into, all right, so we somewhat have a plan. Everybody's on the same page. That might be driven by a PMO. That might be driven by you. But ultimately, what we're trying to figure out is, okay, this particular project that we're working on, we're installing 8,000 cameras. That's a large project. Smaller projects, you're probably not going to spend as much time maybe documenting that you would in a longer term project. How complex is it? How important is it to the organization, right? And then what is our development approach? Because if we can utilize a hybrid, or we can utilize more of an agile or more predictive type of environment, that's going to shift or change the ways that we actually execute the work. And on the agile side of things, the nice thing about that is having reviews at the end. So those of you that are in hybrid, in a past life, working in more of an agile environment, how long are your sprints or iterations usually? Are they 2 weeks? Are they 3 weeks? Are they 4 weeks? How long are your iterations? 2 weeks? That's pretty common now. It used to be more people said, oh, it was 4 weeks, but I'm seeing twos a lot more. 2 weeks, 2 weeks, 2 weeks. The nice thing about running things in 2-week iterations or sprints is that at the end of every 2 weeks, it's like having a lessons learned meeting in the retrospective and the reviews of, let's go through what we produced this week. How did it go? Communicate what impediments affected our ability to actually execute the work that we were supposed to. So you have reviews and then you have retrospectives. Retrospectives are like lessons learned meetings every 2 weeks. Has to be short to implement retro finding sooner. Perfect. I love that. Yes, you're absolutely right. Because a retrospective, if you're not familiar, is essentially the team saying, what are we going to keep doing? What are we going to stop doing? And what are we going to change? Because here's what we figured out to practice that, continuous improvement, to try and implement those changes and get in front of any roadblocks or impediments or things in our way. And let's keep what's working. Let's change what's not. Let's fail faster, succeed sooner is how we represent that. And so every 2 weeks, if we have a lessons learned meeting or a retrospective, and then implement continuous improvement, especially on the risk sides of things and project work in general, that gives us the opportunity to adapt and adjust. The hardest part about predictive is having that lessons learned at the end. Because it's like, what did we learn? Ow, that was painful. Let's not do that again, except the project's over. And so that's why lessons learned, risk, changes, issues, those kinds of things are assumed to be part of sort of our weekly meetings in a predictive environment. I think the hardest part, especially when you're dealing with technology threats, cybersecurity threats, is determining what's the actual root cause of this potential bad thing. And if we can figure out what that root cause is of this potential bad thing, then we can start to really figure out what's the probability, what's the impact, and what's the best response. The other thing, assumptions and constraints. Assumptions are things that we believe to be true without proof. And we have to question those assumptions all the time. Well, we assume that this is going to go this way, and then it doesn't. Now we have information. But assumptions analysis, or questioning those assumptions, is a big piece of trying to assess or identify risks. Also, constraints, time, money, people, those kinds of things, quality. And SWOT can be utilized for strategic brainstorming. Anybody use SWOT at all? I'll show you what it looks like. Those of you who have had classes with me before, I use it a little bit differently from just, opportunities and threats. But at the same time, it's a really great way to target brainstorming. I'm also going to show you prompt lists, which are another good way of having that conversation. The hardest part about root cause analysis, and I get the analysis paralysis side of things. I mean, I am completely risk averse. SWOT's very useful. Rita's saying, yeah, I am completely risk averse. Just in general in life. Like I don't swim in the ocean. I'm not entering the food chain kind of person, right? I'm a rule follower. And so when we're trying to figure out what is the root cause of a potential threat, a lot of times what we'll do is jump to the most obvious reason why something would go sideways, right? And that's called a proximate cause. And I always say it's about 90, 95% of the time that's right. It's the correct cause. We have expert judgment, people who do the work, know the work, and understand the risks. The problem is that in a lot of cases, especially when we're dealing with cybersecurity and things that are a bit less tangible, there might be an intermediate cause where if we don't spend the time or enough time, maybe weekly or every 2 weeks, that kind of thing, trying to determine what would be the catalyst of this, there might be an intermediate cause. If we apply the response to the obvious reason and it isn't the obvious reason, then oops, all of a sudden we have what's called residual risk or even secondary risk. The organizational cause has to be escalated. There's no way that we on our organizational level can fix everything. Sometimes things have to be escalated. Have you ever identified something, like a potential threat, let's say, or something that's gone sideways, and you had to go to management or the organization and say, we can't deal with this on our level? We either need, contractors from the outside, we need better vendors, we need better equipment, we need better materials. Y'all are going to have to take that on because we can't deal with it on our level. If you have, then that's what we're talking about with the organizational cause. But as Rita said, SWOT is very useful. If you're not familiar, it's an excellent way to target brainstorming when you are trying to assess threats and opportunities. So strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, and threats. That's what SWOT stands for. And strengths are what's going really well right now. Like, what do you have going for you right now at work? Do you have a great team of people? Do you have good support from senior management? Do you have great equipment? Just you're a rock star, of course. These are all strengths. And weaknesses are what's not going well right now. Where are some of the cracks or the chinks in the armor that we can kind of address now? Let's see if we can't figure out what the weaknesses are. Now, it would make sense that strengths are good, opportunities for the future. Hey, we got this. We're going to be first to market. That's an opportunity. And then threats are a response to a weakness or something being bad right now. So just out of curiosity, and Rita, you were saying SWOT too, one of the ways that, yes, it makes perfect sense that you go in the column, strengths to opportunities, weaknesses to threats. But I also like to go in the diagonal. It's very hard for me, as people know that have been in my classes, for me not to say Diagon Alley. But going Diagon Alley, well, a lot of times if you look at strengths and you don't take advantage of those strengths, what threats could be created because of that? Like, if we don't leverage this, what problems could we cause in the future? And then weaknesses or challenges right now, what can we, if we overcome them and we do X, Y, Z, could we produce an opportunity in the future? And so have you ever done that on the diagonal? Because it's a really good way to open up the conversation and ask different types of questions, because otherwise it's pretty compartmentalized. But there are some things that we can utilize. The other is going to be what's called a standardized prompt list. A lot of times organizations, especially when trying to determine what projects to pay for, they're going to take a look at anything from the outside that could cause major threats to the projects that they actually select to pay for. And Pestle, TCOP, Spectrum, these are just, and I'll get out of the way so you can see them all, but these are just categories of political, economic, social, technological, legal, environmental aspects coming from the outside most of the time. It could be internal politics, you never know. But most of the time, this is coming from the outside. These are categories that can affect the decisions or the risks that an organization might be willing to undertake. But I always say you can create your own. What categories can we look at, just like SWOT, to help target and get organized and potentially find a common root cause? Qualitative risk analysis, quantitative, don't worry about semantics. This is really about priority. This is about probability and impact so that we can prioritize. One of the reasons why I have the risk register in Excel is I can sort and filter and hide and color code, and I'll build in formulas and that kind of thing. So for me, Excel's an easier tool to work with to try and get a relative ranking, to try and figure out what's near term, far term, to clarify categorizing is a really important thing to do, because if we can categorize, and you'll see if you open it up, I have cybersecurity in there, but if you can kind of focus on that and identify the threats in each category, now maybe we can find a common root cause. And that's really the goal of having the documentation and doing the assessment. Quantitative, though, is about applying a price tag to a threat or an opportunity and looking at the probability. So one of the ways that expected monetary value is utilized, and even if it's just a guess, or you can take, the organizational sort of, here's the worth of this data that we have. But what you're looking at is, if there is a threat to XYZ, what's the probability that we think it will occur? So let's say it's 50%. What's the impact if it were to occur financially at 100%? Let's just call it $100,000. Keep it simple, right? And basically multiply them together. And essentially what you're saying is, this potential threat event's current assessed price tag, or quantitative money value at its assessed probability, is 50,000. And that's not, if it happens, it's only going to be 50 grand. That's not what we're saying. We're trying to utilize monetary losses and gains. Are there areas at Tesla's where a sprint is no more than 5 hours? Boy, they're moving quick, huh? 5-hour sprint, produce something. That's fast. And, the nice thing about that is there's probably a stand-up meeting in there somewhere where they're talking about impediments or what could cause problems, right? But the monetary loss and gain is not like saying, here's what we'll inevitably pay if this were to occur. It's instead saying, how do we make the best decisions for responses? I think cybersecurity will be the same or shorter in near future. I agree too, because things are moving so quickly, right? And so even if it's one day, a one-day sprint, something like that, what do we implement? And there's no way that I could say, or anybody could say, if this happens, do this. But there are options. We can escalate if we can't deal with it. We can avoid, we can make changes, and that could be agile or predictive. Usually it's like change your project management. But in an agile environment, how do we pivot? How do we change? Maybe we have a 5-hour sprint like Tesla. How do we adapt and adjust what we're doing to avoid something from happening in the first place? And a lot of that is what we talked about earlier, which could be training or education or better best practices. Maybe we hire a company that handles, cybersecurity and that kind of thing, but that would be through procurement. Mitigation is just, how do we reduce the probability and impact? Or do we have money or time contingency to say, yeah, we actively accept we've got to throw money at this thing, or we have to throw time at this thing? Or is it at such a low level, we don't really need to deal with it? But most organizations, and you can just yes or no me, most organizations have what are called contingent response strategies. If this happens, do this. Do you have these situations where, oh, it's go time, that just happened, do that. That's how you fix it. Because the contingent response strategies are a really, really great way of making sure that everybody understands, if this happens, this is the trigger, it's go time. And now we implement our risk responses, so and if we have reserves, a lot of times project managers build their own in. Here's our little hidden bucket of money, hidden bucket of time, just in case this goes sideways, so that management we don't have to escalate, ask or beg or cry or steal or whatever it is, money from senior management. But essentially what you're looking at is a very prettied up version of the Excel spreadsheet that we had you for download for the risk register. And so I always start with the categories, the description of the risk, who's the owner, who are the people that are going to implement the response, might not be us, right? I have the impact and probability on a 1 through 5 scale, and then the formula is built right in. So it's going to flip it, and then it'll flip the stoplight, because some companies use red, yellow, green. But essentially, the higher the score, the more of the threat that we have to worry about. So that's going to be a higher prioritized item. And then indicators, we'll talk about in just a moment, but what are our preventative actions? What are our strategies? What are our contingent response strategies? What are our action plans? And updating this is iterative. every single day, because we need to be able to implement those agreed upon responses, because we don't want to be just kind of like, we're freaking out. It's performed throughout the project, and it's sort of like, well, duh, you have your responses, you implement them at the time. One thing for me is triggers. And I feel triggered, but a risk trigger is an event that lets you know the risk event is on its way. The problem is that triggers are usually hindsight. Have you ever had a situation in any event at work where something happens, it goes sideways, and you look back and that's why that happened. Those are called triggers. If you know the trigger in advance, great, document it. That way people know, all right, it's go time for the responses. But a lot of times it's hindsight's 2020. But documenting those things for your retrospectives, for your lessons learned meetings, can help prevent something from occurring in the future. And because this is iterative, it's happening all the time. We want to make sure that we're staying in front of whatever's changing, especially in project management, cybersecurity, technology, all of that. Sometimes what happens is we implement a risk response and it's not the right response, and we create a whole nother problem. That does happen occasionally. That's called a secondary risk. That's when you grab the fire hose, right? That's when you put the fire out and try and make sure that we've, done the best we can with our fallback plan. And then residual risk is leftover risk. It's risk residue. That's what I think of it with you. Risk residue, that we implement the risk response and we don't get it all, but it's not at an acceptable level. And so at that point, but these are the situations that we want to save the panic button for the fire hose approach, is that we tried to deal with it, we didn't deal with it well, and now we have this additional problem. What's the workaround? What was the trigger? These would be things that we would discuss in a weekly meeting or in a retrospective, as we're iteratively keeping an eye on risk. So is our strategy still valid? Has our overall level of risk changed? Maybe not. Are our responses effective or not? How many of you have those conversations? Do you have like a lessons learned or retrospective where you're talking specifically about risk? Hey, we fixed this and it worked. Or hey, we tried to fix that and it didn't work. Or is that more saved for at the end of the project? I mean, those of you that are doing risk management, I would imagine it's like all the time, right? At least weekly, if not daily, as far as what impediments are in our way, that kind of thing. But would you say, and I know some of you are like, oh, we're still stepping on our toes, or we're still trying to work this out. But at the same time, that iterative nature has to be like implemented. And it's tough because there's so many other things going on. It's like, oh, well, we don't really have time for that. One of the things that we can do, and Kim's saying we consistently try to close risks, keep them from being issues. Yeah, issues are risks that have been realized. So, and they're always bad. That's a good thing, because that issue log is another thing that can be utilized. But the issues are like, there it is, it happened. Whereas risk carries probability and impact. It might happen, it might not. So one thing that a lessons learned meeting is good for, and the predictive side or retrospective is good for on the more agile side of things, is the audit. An audit just means, how are we doing? Are we doing a good job or not? Some organizations will have an external auditor come in, and that could be for quality, that could be for risk, that could be for process, having somebody from the outside looking in. But we can definitely audit. One of the reasons why I wanted to talk a little bit about CompTIA Project Plus. I know a lot of you are PMP certified, and that's awesome. I know a lot of you probably have team members that maybe aren't certified. But what I like about the trend that I'm seeing with all of these organizations, the Project Management Institute and CompTIA, is starting to recognize that 25% of hiring managers want project management skills, period. And the ability to manage risk and scope and schedules and so on, plus our real jobs, right? But having that IT focus is becoming much more necessary in our worlds as technology changes like at the speed of sound. And so that agile focus is also a big deal. Those of you that are practicing agile, oh, and let me know this. Those of you who are practicing or have practiced agile iteration sprints, etc. Was it an organizational thing where they said, "Hey, this is how we're doing it?" Or was it more of a bottom-up decision by you and your team to try and implement some of these best practices? Because that's the hardest part, is that an organization might be like, "Oh, agile is the flavor of the month," and they go to implement it, and then it's just bad. It's poorly implemented. And then the organization says agile doesn't work. It was project specific, Sandy saying. Nice. And that's a good thing. CT, any advice for me? I'll be taking the Certified Agile Leadership course next week. The Agile Certified Practitioner, or a different one, Certified Agile Leader course. What I would definitely say is just bear in mind that you're going to be learning best practices. That's what we do. We teach best practices. But the key to Agile is making sure that you can utilize Agile organizationally, and a lot of times it's painful. That's why I asked if it's bottom up or top down implemented. So it might be trying one or two things to see if they work. It's going to take some change. There's going to be a little bit of chaos, that kind of thing. So if your question is less about the course and more about what do I do after the course, those are just some of the things that I would keep in mind, is that pick and choose things that you feel like would fit or work in your organization and then practice them. Knowing that anytime something changes, adults don't like change a lot. So anytime something changes, it will take practice for sure. But the ability to run things in shorter iterations, to identify risks, to adapt, to adjust, to change. That's why all these certifications are changing. But Project Plus is the next one in line. You're welcome. So we're going to launch that in November. That's before the actual new exam comes out. But it used to be, the CompTIA it was like old school predictive project management. They've really, really cleaned it up. I'm writing the course now. It has a lot more IT focus than what I'm seeing in the PMP, because the PMP is like predictive, agile, hybrid, but they're not specifically talking about the cloud or software or how to apply agile to an IT type of project. And so it's definitely a major facelift from what it was before. So if you've got folks on your team that are new, you're thinking about hiring, those types of things, I think it's a really good start. I think jumping into like the CAPM, the Certified Associate in Project Management, is changing also, but it doesn't have an IT focus. It's more generic. So if you've got folks coming in and you're like, they need some training, then I really like the new CompTIA class. And I'm always honest. Those of you who've taken classes with me before, I was not impressed with the last version. This one, I am. I'm like, all right, way to like catch up with the times, CompTIA. That's awesome. Other Agile classes, if that's something that you're interested in, I have a bunch. The Agile Certified Practitioner. I also do tutorials for Planner. I don't know if anybody's using Microsoft Planner. If you have 365, you have an app that you might not even know you have. For task boards, working with Kanban, everything that I teach counts for professional development units. But that's just a cross section. Obviously, as mentioned, it's only 1 hour, so there's no way we could go through a lot. But I really felt like focusing on the risk side of things, because it's such a huge deal in IT and cybersecurity, putting into place some best practices are good, whether it's agile or predictive. But if you are interested in getting your folks into Project Plus, or you want to jump into an Agile class, whether you feel like getting certified or not, there's a lot of people in that Agile Certified Practitioner class that don't get their certs. They're just there for information on best practices. Any specific certs for cybersecurity project management? That's actually going to be more of like a combo approach. We have some amazing cybersecurity classes, but I'm on the project management side. So we talk about it in class, but nothing that like is specific to that. I'm sure they're out there, but it would be tough because there's so many different industries with so many different like compliance laws and countries and things like that. So support can chat in some of the classes that we have that are specific for cybersecurity for sure. If you're interested in anything anything that we teach. If you look at the calendar, you look at the different classes, you go out to stormwindstudios.com and check out the courses. But if you want to get a discount, Mike will hook you up. Those of you that have taken classes with me before and you're trying to maintain your professional development units, I'd love to see you come back for sure. Your team just started using Planner. I don't have a webinar on it, but I do have a tutorial on it, but that's a good idea. That might be something that I do a webinar on in my next one. So I'll talk with my team about that. Maybe we could do a demo of it because I love Planner. Planner's awesome for sure. But I do have a pre-recorded class. And once you figure out Planner, you like won't ever go back. But I am conscious of all of your time. So I really appreciate you joining me today for an hour or one professional development unit. For everybody here at StormWind Studios, PM Guru, thank you so much. Feel free to always reach out to me via email, Ashley, ASHLEY.HUNT at stormwindlive.com. I'll chat it in once I wrap up here. You are most welcome, but feel free to reach out to me with any questions. Past student, future student, not a student, doesn't matter. Feel free to reach out to me and I'll be happy to help you. Thank you guys so much. TGIF, have a fantastic weekend and I look forward to seeing you in a class sometime soon. Thanks everybody. Bye.